A civilization worth defending. Western civilization is the most ambitious endeavor in human history, an edifice built upon the pillars of reason, liberty, and human dignity. From the marble colonnades of Athens to the legislative halls of Washington, the West has for millennia refined and elevated the human condition. Its inheritance is not one of mere wealth or power, but of ideas. The rule of law, the sovereignty of the individual, the relentless pursuit of knowledge, and the conviction that truth exists, independent of decree or doctrine. Yet, as we survey the modern West, across Britain, Germany, Canada, and the United States, we must confront an unsettling reality. The very civilization that once lifted humanity from ignorance and tyranny now finds itself faltering, not from external conquest, but from a willful erosion within. Carl Sagan, in The Demon-Haunted World, warned that civilizations perish not in sudden cataclysm, but in the slow retreat from reason into the abyss of superstition and ideological dogma. He hailed the scientific method as the most profound instrument ever devised for distinguishing truth from falsehood, an achievement made possible only by the intellectual traditions of the West. His warning was not limited to science. It spoke to the very framework of free societies. For when a civilization abandons the pursuit of objective truth in favor of sentiment and decree, when it places ideology above inquiry and power above principle, it does not merely risk decline, it ensures it. Across the Western world, we now witness the signs of such decay. Free speech is no longer an inviolable right, but a privilege contingent upon ideological conformity. Economic policies defy the immutable laws of supply and demand, straining the prosperity that once defined these nations. Empirical evidence is cast aside when it conflicts with prevailing orthodoxies. These are not isolated missteps, but symptoms of a deeper malady, a civilization unmoored from the very principles that made it strong. Sagan cautioned that civilizations that reject reason do not merely stagnate, they unravel. And so we must ask, will the West reclaim the values that lifted it from the darkness of tyranny and ignorance, or will it surrender to the forces that seek to unmake it? This is no idle question. The answer will determine whether the West endures or becomes another cautionary tale whispered in the ruins of what once was. The foundations of the West. Western civilization is not the product of chance, nor is it a mere aggregation of historical accidents. It is the hard-won result of millennia of intellectual, cultural, and moral refinement, a process of relentless struggle, adaptation, and discovery. It was in the city-states of Greece that democracy and philosophy first took root, establishing the primacy of reasoned debate, the dignity of the individual, and the radical notion that rulers might be accountable to the governed. Rome, with its vast legal and administrative genius, transformed these abstract ideals into institutions, laying down the foundations of law, engineering, and an early form of citizenship that extended beyond tribal or hereditary allegiance. Yet it was Christianity that infused these structural achievements with a profound moral dimension, elevating the worth of the individual to a sacred principle. In its insistence that every soul possessed inherent dignity, regardless of birth, wealth, or station, Christianity forged the ethical bedrock upon which the West would build its greatest institutions. From this fusion of Greco-Roman rationalism and Christian moral philosophy arose the framework that would sustain Western civilization for centuries: a belief in universal rights, the rule of law, and the moral responsibility of both rulers and the ruled. The Enlightenment, far from discarding these traditions, refined them. It did not reject the past, but illuminated its strengths. The thinkers of this era, Locke, Montesquieu, Smith, and Kant, codified the principles of personal liberty, limited government, and scientific inquiry, igniting the greatest explosion of progress in human history. The Western world, once fragmented and bound by feudal chains, emerged into an era where knowledge, industry, and freedom would dictate the course of nations. Lord Acton, in The History of Freedom, captures this arc of Western development as a continuous struggle against unchecked power in favor of individual liberty. Unlike civilizations that surrendered to the whims of despots and emperors, the West developed mechanisms, parliaments, constitutions, legal codes, that restricted the reach of authority and protected the autonomy of the citizen. Christianity, in this respect, played a pivotal role by asserting that no king, no emperor, no government could claim absolute dominion over the soul of man. It placed a divine limit on human power. Bertrand Russell, in A History of Western Philosophy, underscores the intellectual evolution of the West as a dialogue, one that began with Socrates, Aristotle, and Aquinas, and continued through the Renaissance and Enlightenment. At its core, Western civilization was not built on dogma, but on discourse, not on blind tradition, but on the capacity for reasoned self-examination. This willingness to question, to refine, and to debate ensured that Western societies did not remain stagnant, but progressed, often at great cost, toward higher ideals. Joseph Henrich, in The Weirdest People in the World, provides an empirical foundation for what history has long suggested, that Western civilization's unique emphasis on logic, individual responsibility, and free institutions is the product of deep cultural and psychological evolution. Unlike many other civilizations where identity was defined by rigid collectivism, the West nurtured a mindset that encouraged independence, critical thought, and long-term planning, qualities that proved indispensable to its prosperity and endurance. Francis Fukuyama, in The Origins of Political Order, further strengthens this argument by tracing the West's distinct political trajectory. He identifies the unique combination of legal traditions, representative governance, and a vibrant civil society as the essential factors that made the West the cradle of modern democracy. Unlike societies where authority remained unchecked, the West pioneered systems that balanced power and institutionalized the principles of justice and accountability. Yet if we look at the modern Western world, we see a tragic irony unfolding before us. The very principles that forged this civilization are being methodically abandoned. In England, citizens are arrested for expressing unpopular opinions on social media while actual criminals roam free. In Germany, free speech is no longer considered a right but a privilege, granted or withdrawn based on political expediency. In Canada, laws are passed that criminalize speech, which diverges from government-approved orthodoxy. Even in the United States, the First Amendment, once the bedrock of American exceptionalism, is being steadily undermined by the collusion of corporate and state power as dissenting voices are silenced under the pretext of combating misinformation. This is not merely political mismanagement, it is a civilizational amnesia, a rejection of the very ideas that made the West the most free, prosperous, and enlightened civilization in history. If this trend continues unchecked, the West will not fall to an external enemy, but to its own abandonment of the principles that once set it apart. A new Renaissance, reclaiming the Western tradition. The Renaissance was not merely a nostalgic return to the past. It was a bold act of synthesis, a fusion of classical wisdom with the moral and intellectual depth of Christian scholasticism. The thinkers of that era did not simply copy the works of Aristotle and Cicero. They challenged, refined, and integrated them with the theological and philosophical insights of Augustine, Aquinas, and the medieval university tradition. It was this powerful combination, reason disciplined by moral order, faith tempered by logic, that unleashed the greatest cultural and intellectual flourishing the world had ever seen. Today, the West stands at another crossroads, and if it is to survive, it must do what it has done before, undergo a new renaissance. This is not a call to retreat into the past, nor to blindly reject modern advancements, but to recognize that the West has lost the very mechanism that once made it strong. Its ability to reconcile tradition with innovation, faith with reason, virtue with knowledge. For too long, the false dichotomy between faith and reason has crippled our institutions. The secular world, in its quest for limitless autonomy, has severed itself from the moral foundations that once gave it purpose. Meanwhile, those who still hold to tradition often fail to engage with the intellectual rigor that once made the West a beacon of scholarship and inquiry. If the Renaissance had simply resurrected pagan philosophy without Christian ethics, it would have led to the same despotism that consumed Rome. Likewise, if it had clung to medieval dogma without the fire of rediscovery, it would have remained stagnant. The lesson is clear. Civilizations do not thrive by rejecting their past or freezing it in time, but by renewing it. We must look to those who mastered this balance. Petrarch, the father of humanism, revered both the wisdom of antiquity and the moral refinement of Christianity. The great universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna did not shy away from difficult questions, but engaged them head-on, blending theology with law, medicine, and philosophy. The architects of the Renaissance were not afraid of contradiction. They sought to resolve it through synthesis, just as the Enlightenment thinkers who followed them built upon their achievements rather than discarding them. This is what the West needs now, not a passive longing for what once was, but an active reawakening. It must reclaim the confidence to stand upon its own foundations while adapting to the challenges of the modern world. It must rediscover the unifying principles that once guided it, the belief in objective truth, the pursuit of excellence, the conviction that knowledge is not an instrument of power, but a pathway to human flourishing. The alternative is cultural and intellectual stagnation, a slow retreat into irrelevance as other civilizations, many of which still recognize the power of tradition, assert themselves in the void left by the West's own uncertainty. If the Renaissance proved anything, it is that the West is not doomed to decline. It has always been capable of renewal, so long as it has the will to reclaim its inheritance and move forward with purpose. This is our moment. Will we rise to it? The West's contributions to human flourishing. The triumphs of Western civilization are not mere abstractions confined to the pages of philosophy or the echoes of academic halls. They are the foundation upon which the modern world stands, the architecture of human progress itself. Unlike civilizations that languished under the weight of rigid collectivism, the West has been defined by its ceaseless pursuit of individual freedom, economic innovation, and scientific discovery. The principles first kindled in Athens, refined by Rome, sanctified by Christianity, and unleashed by the Enlightenment did more than shape ideas. They reshaped existence. They gave birth to political systems that honored the rights of the individual, economic frameworks that elevated entire nations from poverty to prosperity, and scientific breakthroughs that shattered the constraints of nature itself. The West did not inherit a perfect world. It built one. It was not satisfied with the traditions of the past, but demanded something greater. Where others accepted the inevitability of suffering, the West pursued medicine to defeat it. Where others resigned themselves to scarcity, the West unlocked the power of markets to transcend it. Where others saw ignorance as fate, the West made knowledge a right, not a privilege. This legacy is not incidental. It is the direct result of a civilization that, unlike so many before it, refused to submit to dogma or stagnation. It was the West that first declared that rulers must be bound by law, that wealth must be created rather than plundered, that the mind must be free to seek truth wherever it leads. And it is only because of these principles that, for the first time in history, poverty is the exception rather than the rule. Lifespans stretch into decades that once seemed unfathomable, and knowledge is not hoarded by the few but accessible to all. Yet, as with all great achievements, these gains are not immutable. They are the inheritance of a civilization that believed in its own purpose. If that belief is abandoned, if the West forgets what made it great, then these contributions will not endure, they will be lost, and with them, the very progress they made possible. Political freedom. The triumph of the individual. Before the rise of the West, the individual was a mere subject, bound by the dictates of kings, warlords, and chieftains, his fate determined not by his own will, but by the arbitrary power of those who ruled. The notion that a man might govern himself, that authority must be accountable to the governed, was not the natural order of things. It was a radical departure from history, a uniquely Western innovation born of struggle, defiance, and an unyielding demand for liberty. This idea did not emerge in a single moment, nor was it gifted from above. It was carved out of centuries of resistance to tyranny. The signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 was a watershed moment, forcing an English king to acknowledge that his power had limits, that he was not above the law. It was the first real breach in the ancient presumption that rulers reigned by divine right, introducing instead the revolutionary notion that authority could be restrained and compelled to answer to its people. This principle was carried forward into the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which formally established parliamentary supremacy and enshrined the rights of the citizen over the unchecked will of the sovereign. But it was John Locke who took this principle to its ultimate conclusion, arguing that government itself must derive its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. This idea, so bold in its implications, laid the intellectual foundation for the greatest political experiment in human history, the United States of America. The American Revolution of 1776 was not merely a rebellion against colonial rule. It was a declaration of a new political order, one that rejected the old world's hierarchy of subjects and sovereigns in favor of self-government and individual rights. Thomas Jefferson's immortal words in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," marked a turning point in human history. Never before had a nation been founded on the explicit principle that rights were not granted by rulers, but were inherent to all men. The Constitution that followed did not merely codify these rights, but sought to guard them against the very forces that had crushed liberty in ages past. By limiting the power of government, enshrining the rule of law, and constructing a system in which no man, no matter how powerful, could rule unchecked, the American founders created a blueprint that would inspire democratic revolutions across the world. Even the French Revolution of 1789, for all its chaos and bloodshed, was fueled by the same ideals. The spread of democratic governance across the 19th and 20th centuries can be traced back to these moments, when the West declared unequivocally that the individual was sovereign. But what was won through centuries of struggle is now being relinquished without a fight. The nations that once carried the torch of liberty are now dimming its flame with bureaucratic suppression and creeping authoritarianism. In England, citizens are arrested for social media posts that violate the nebulous dictates of offensive speech. In Germany, the state determines which opinions are permissible and punishes those who dare to challenge official narratives. The very nations that once defied kings and tore down tyrannies now impose their own ideological orthodoxy, silencing dissent not with the sword but with laws and corporate complicity. This erosion of political freedom is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a symptom of something deeper, a civilization turning against its own principles, forsaking the ideals that once made it great. A culture that once championed free speech and the sovereignty of the individual is now paralyzed by the fear of offense. And if this trajectory continues, the West will not merely lose its liberties, it will lose itself. Economic prosperity, the West's gift to the world. No force in history has lifted more people out of poverty, created more wealth, or unleashed more human potential than Western civilization. It was not conquest, nor plunder, nor mere luck that propelled the West to economic dominance, but the mastery of wealth creation itself, achieved through innovation, free markets, and the sanctity of private property. For centuries, humanity toiled under stagnant economies where wealth was hoarded, not generated. The ruling classes clutched their fortunes while the masses subsisted on what little remained. But in the West, a different path emerged, one that embraced competition, rewarded ingenuity, and understood that prosperity was not finite, but could be expanded. The birth of capitalism, articulated by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, 1776, was a declaration of economic liberation. Smith's insight was simple but revolutionary. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. With this, the West shattered the medieval notion that prosperity required state control or aristocratic permission. Instead, it affirmed that individual ambition, when channeled through voluntary exchange and the rule of law, could generate wealth on a scale previously unimaginable. The results were immediate and profound. Where other civilizations remained bound by feudal economies or command systems, the West surged ahead, driven by the creativity of free men rather than the dictates of central planners. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, was the direct outgrowth of this system. Steam power, mechanized factories, railroads, these were not the products of bureaucratic decree, but of individuals empowered to think, build, and profit. The spirit of enterprise spread rapidly to Germany and the United States, where industry flourished, and by the early 20th century, Western civilization had secured its place as the engine of global economic progress. The transformation was staggering. Life expectancy soared from an average of 35 years in the 1700s to nearly 50 by 1900, and today surpassing 75 in most developed nations. The West's advancements in medicine, sanitation, and nutrition turned early death from an expectation into an anomaly. Poverty collapsed. Before capitalism, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. Today, that number has fallen to under 10%, thanks almost entirely to the West's economic model spreading across the globe. Agricultural productivity exploded. The Green Revolution of the 20th century, pioneered by Western scientists like Norman Borlaug, saved over 1 billion people from starvation by developing high-yield crops and modern farming techniques. Yet now, inexplicably, the West seems intent on dismantling the very economic foundations that made its success possible. In Germany, an industrial powerhouse for generations, energy policies have abandoned reliability in favor of ideological posturing, leading to soaring costs and economic decline. In the UK, entrepreneurship is strangled by bureaucratic overreach, as innovation is sacrificed on the altar of redistribution. Across the West, governments impose crushing regulations, stifle competition, and prioritize entitlement over enterprise. These are not the actions of a civilization striving for greater prosperity. They are the signs of one in retreat. To reject free markets is to reject the West itself. The very principles that built the modern world, private property, voluntary exchange, and the liberty to create and trade, are not just economic theories, they are the engines of civilization. When these principles erode, prosperity does not merely slow, it reverses. And if the West does not recognize this, it will not be long before the wealth it once generated is but a memory. Scientific and technological progress, the West's legacy of discovery. No civilization has done more to advance human understanding than the West. The scientific method, the foundation of all modern discovery, emerged from a culture that valued reason over superstition, inquiry over dogma, and truth over ideological convenience. From the laws of physics to the mapping of the human genome, from space exploration to artificial intelligence, the great leaps of human knowledge have been almost exclusively Western achievements. This is no coincidence. The West alone created an intellectual climate where free thought could thrive. It produced societies that did not merely preserve knowledge, but pursued it relentlessly, where scholars were not confined to the service of rulers, but could challenge authority itself. It was this commitment to empirical truth that led Sir Isaac Newton to write Principia Mathematica, 1687, laying out the laws of motion and universal gravitation, fundamental discoveries that would shape the course of physics forever. Newton himself recognized that his work stood upon a long tradition of Western thought, remarking, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." The West did not stop at physics. It produced Albert Einstein, whose theory of relativity revolutionized our understanding of space, time, and energy. It brought forth the digital revolution, pioneered in the United States, which gave the world the personal computer, the internet, and artificial intelligence, transformations that redefined communication, commerce, and the very nature of human interaction. And yet, despite this unparalleled legacy, Western nations today seem intent on undermining the very spirit of discovery that propelled them to greatness. Scientific inquiry is increasingly shackled by ideological constraints. Researchers are pressured to produce conclusions that align with political dogma rather than objective truth. Universities, once the epicenters of free thought, now operate as ideological gatekeepers, punishing dissent and rewarding conformity. This is not the trajectory of a civilization on the ascent. It is the pattern of one retreating into stagnation. The same societies that once unlocked the secrets of the cosmos now risk becoming paralyzed by self-imposed intellectual limits. If the West surrenders its scientific heritage to the forces of censorship and ideological control, it will not simply lose its place as the leader of progress, it will forfeit its claim to the future itself. The politicization of science, a civilization at war with truth. Western civilization, more than any other, built its foundations on the pursuit of truth. From the Socratic method to the Enlightenment, from Galileo's defiance of dogma to the technological revolutions of the 20th century, the West's greatest achievements were born of its willingness to challenge assumptions, discard falsehoods, and follow evidence wherever it led. But today, in a grotesque inversion of that tradition, science is no longer the relentless search for truth. It is increasingly a tool of ideological enforcement. Nowhere is this clearer than in the way political orthodoxy dictates which lines of inquiry may be pursued, which conclusions may be published, and which voices may be heard. Universities, once bastions of intellectual freedom, now police discourse with inquisitorial zeal. Researchers are not merely encouraged, but compelled to arrive at the correct answers, lest they find themselves ostracized, defunded, or branded as heretics in the new secular dogma. The COVID-19 pandemic laid bare the extent of this corruption. Scientific debate, the very process that has historically refined medical knowledge, was silenced in favor of centralized decree. Theories that questioned state narratives, whether on lockdown efficacy, vaccine policies, or the origins of the virus, were not debated, but censored outright. Dissenting scientists were ridiculed, deplatformed, and in some cases stripped of their credentials, not because they were necessarily wrong, but because their conclusions were inconvenient to the political class. Climate science has suffered a similar fate. Genuine inquiry into environmental policy has been replaced by a rigid ideological narrative, not a discussion of competing solutions, but a demand for absolute compliance. The claim that the science is settled is itself an unscientific assertion, designed not to foster understanding but to silence alternative viewpoints. The West, which once revolutionized agriculture, energy production, and industrial efficiency through fearless innovation, now punishes those who dare to question radical policies that threaten economic stability under the guise of environmental virtue. This corruption extends beyond the hard sciences into fields like psychology, medicine, and education. The past decade has witnessed the rise of social justice science, a discipline in which conclusions are predetermined by political necessity rather than empirical rigor. Concepts such as unconscious bias and systemic oppression are treated as unassailable truths, despite often lacking reproducible evidence or clear methodological foundations. Objective biological realities are dismissed as social constructs when they conflict with ideological imperatives. The very institutions that once safeguarded truth have in many cases become instruments of deception. Carl Sagan warned that when societies abandon reason, they do not simply stagnate, they decay. And as science becomes more about political allegiance than discovery, as universities become more about ideological indoctrination than education, as inquiry is replaced by obedience, we must ask, how much longer can the West sustain its legacy of innovation when it is no longer allowed to question? The answer is clear. It cannot. The civilization that once charted the stars, harnessed the atom, and decoded the human genome will not endure if it abandons the very principle that made those achievements possible, the freedom to think, to question, and to speak the truth without fear. A civilization on the brink the West has given the world its most enduring institutions, constitutional government, free markets, and scientific enlightenment. It has created the conditions for human flourishing on an unprecedented scale. But these achievements were neither accidental nor inevitable. They were hard-won and fiercely defended by generations who understood that civilization, like liberty, requires vigilance. Now we stand at the precipice of a great unraveling. The principles that elevated the West, free speech, individual rights, economic liberty, and the relentless pursuit of truth, are being abandoned, not through conquest, but through neglect, self-doubt, and ideological subversion. The early symptoms of decline are no longer subtle. In nations like Germany and the United Kingdom, excellence has been replaced by bureaucratic mediocrity. Economic prudence has given way to reckless redistribution, and national pride has been hollowed out by cultural self-flagellation. History does not look kindly on civilizations that lose confidence in their own values. The question before us is stark. Will the West reclaim its inheritance, or will it allow itself to be dismantled by those who neither understand nor respect the civilization they have inherited? The answer will not merely shape the fate of Western nations, it will determine the course of human history itself. The assault on Western identity. Despite its triumphs, the West now faces an existential crisis, a loss of faith in itself. The civilization that once saw its values as the engine of progress and human dignity is now told that its history is a ledger of oppression rather than achievement. The result is a culture gripped by guilt, where the very foundations of Western society, reason, liberty, self-reliance, are dismissed as artifacts of a past unworthy of preservation. Mass immigration and cultural fragmentation. The great civilizations of history did not merely expand their borders. They ensured that those who entered became part of their fabric. The United Kingdom and Germany, however, have implemented immigration policies that ignored the necessity of assimilation, allowing entire communities to develop parallel societies rather than integrate into the national identity. This failure has played out across the Western world. The consequences are stark: rising crime, social fragmentation, and an increasing number of citizens who view Western traditions not as something to embrace, but as something to dismantle. In Germany, once great cities now contain districts where law enforcement hesitates to tread, and local resources are strained under the weight of mass migration. The town of Suhl, once a quiet German municipality, now houses residents from over 92 nations, with local crime statistics reflecting a disproportionate number of offenses committed by non-citizens. Schools struggle to educate students who do not speak the native language, further accelerating the erosion of national cohesion. The problem is not immigration itself. The West has long been a destination for those seeking a better life. The issue is scale, integration, and an unwillingness by political leaders to acknowledge reality. Despite former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's admission in 2010 that multiculturalism had utterly failed, Germany and other Western nations continued policies that ignored history's warnings. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence that social cohesion is fraying, many Western leaders refuse to change course. They double down, insisting that any resistance to unchecked immigration is driven by bigotry rather than concern for national stability. The examples of Denmark and Japan prove that immigration can be handled responsibly, with measured policies ensuring that newcomers adopt the values of their host nation rather than transform them. But these examples remain the exception, not the rule. Unchecked immigration without a cultural framework for integration does not enrich nations. It dissolves them. A society that cannot defend its own identity will not remain a society for long. The death of free speech. When citizens begin to question the changes taking place in their countries, when they voice their concerns over the erosion of their culture and heritage, the response from the ruling class is always the same. First, their concerns are ridiculed, then their speech is labeled offensive. Finally, it is criminalized. Free speech, once the bedrock of Western progress, is now under siege. In Germany, social media companies face massive fines if they fail to remove content deemed hateful by government censors, a term so broadly defined that it can be used to silence political dissent. In the United Kingdom, individuals have been arrested for social media posts that challenge government policies on immigration, gender ideology, or national identity. This is not an anomaly. It is part of a calculated pattern. Across the West, the ability to speak freely is being curtailed under the guise of combating misinformation and hate speech. The real objective is clear: to suppress opposition, eliminate public debate, and establish a climate where only state-approved narratives are permitted. This is not merely a European phenomenon. In the United States, the Biden administration was revealed to have pressured social media companies to censor political opponents, interfering with the free flow of information in what should be the world's leading bastion of liberty. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau froze the bank accounts of truckers who dared to protest vaccine mandates, using financial punishment to quell dissent. The trend is unmistakable. The governments of the West, once the defenders of free speech, now operate in ways eerily reminiscent of the authoritarian regimes they once opposed. The justification may be different, but the effect is the same: silence, conformity, and the slow suffocation of liberty. This is how civilizations die, not in a sudden collapse, but in the quiet acceptance of censorship, the gradual retreat from open discourse, and the replacement of truth with ideology. If the West does not reassert its commitment to free speech, it will not merely lose its rights, it will lose its soul, economic policies, and national viability. When ideology eclipses pragmatism, when virtue signaling supplants sound governance, when economic policy becomes theater rather than strategy, decline is inevitable. The West, once the engine of global prosperity, now finds itself hamstrung by leaders who prioritize ideological purity over national viability. Germany, a nation once synonymous with industrial might, has shuttered its nuclear plants in favor of unreliable energy sources, sending costs skyrocketing and manufacturing into retreat. The United Kingdom, rather than cultivating entrepreneurship, suffocates its industries with overregulation and burdensome taxation. Across the Western world, governments no longer ask what will produce prosperity. They ask what will be most palatable to the activist class. The consequences are dire. Energy shortages, stagnating wages, and an affordability crisis now grip the United States, Canada, and much of Europe. Not due to natural economic cycles, but as the direct result of policies that view wealth creation with suspicion and economic dynamism as a threat rather than an opportunity. The working class, once the proud backbone of Western prosperity, now bears the brunt of these failures, sacrificed on the altar of globalist abstractions and bureaucratic hubris. This is not progress. It is managed decline, disguised as moral virtue. A civilization that undermines its own economic foundations will not long endure. Prosperity is not a natural state. It must be cultivated, protected, and passed down. If the West does not return to policies that prioritize growth, innovation, and self-reliance, it will not merely fall behind, it will cease to lead altogether. Why the West must be defended. Western civilization is not just another culture among many. It is the singular force that has, time and again, lifted humanity from the depths of ignorance, oppression, and poverty. Its values, freedom, reason, and innovation, have shaped a world where more people live in security, prosperity, and dignity than ever before. But these gains are not inevitable, nor are they irreversible. Across the Western world, the forces of self-destruction are already at work. Institutions once dedicated to knowledge now peddle ideology. Governments once committed to liberty now seek to suppress dissent. Economies once driven by ingenuity are now shackled by bureaucratic inertia. If this trajectory continues, the West will not simply decline, it will be replaced. By what? Will China's model of totalitarian control become the global standard? Will the radical ideologies of resurgent Marxism or militant Islam shape the future? Will the postmodern rejection of objective truth render any defense of liberty impossible? We stand at a crossroads. The West can either reaffirm its principles, reclaiming its heritage of freedom, reason, and self-determination, or it can surrender to dissolution, leaving future generations to inherit a civilization they no longer recognize. Defending the West does not require blind nationalism, nor does it demand an uncritical embrace of its past. It requires an honest reckoning, a recognition that while the West has flaws, the alternative, an abandonment of liberty, reason, and individual dignity, is far worse. This decline is not inevitable. Western nations do not have to continue down this path. The principles that built this civilization, free speech, economic dynamism, scientific inquiry, and national identity, are not relics of the past. They are the key to the future. But they must be defended, not someday, not when it is convenient, but now. Because if we fail, we may wake up to find that there is nothing left to defend.